and welcome to another alternate media special. Tonight is going to be a really awesome event. Super excited about it. We'll be discussing Genesis chapter 6, the Book of Enoch, even maybe get into the Book of Jubilees a little bit, and a lot of the controversy surrounding those. My guest tonight is none other than Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Let's bring him on. Thank you for joining me tonight, sir.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, the way I usually like to start things off is maybe a little less serious before we get into the heavy stuff. And I've been curious myself, what inspired the name Inspiring Philosophy?
Well, it's not as epic as some people might think it is. Basically, it's back in the early days of YouTube. I think 2011 is when I started. I was just trying different names to see if I could finally get something. So I tried things like Theistic Thinker, taken. I'm gonna try the Aspiring Philosopher, taken. Coffee Table Philosophy, taken. Inspiring Philosophy. Oh, it worked. Okay, this has worked. So I wanted something kind of generic at the time, because at the time I was still kind of, I think my faith was a little bit on shaky grounds at times, and I thought, well, what if I get deconverted? I don't want to have a Christian name, kind of thing. But over time, I think the more I did apologetics and just dealt with how bad I think the arguments from the atheist side are, the more I was just solidified in my faith. But that's kind of what the name came about. I was just sort of putting things in YouTube, hoping to finally get something that would be kind of generic and would be kind of cool, like a cool philosophy channel kind of thing.
That's awesome. I think that's cool that it's, I'm sure everybody just assumes that there's an awesome story behind it, and then to find out that it's not that, it's kind of it's a self-lived joke almost.
Yeah. Just sort of like me just saying, well, will this work? Well, this one works. Fine. This is it. I'm inspiring philosophy now.
I see. I love it. What would you say is the goal of Inspiring Philosophy? What are you trying to accomplish through this ministry?
So the original goal was I was on Facebook getting in debates, and I felt like I was constantly repeating myself. So I'm like, I'll make a couple of videos I can use, and then that way I don't have to constantly repeat myself, and I'll contribute to the Christian apologetic community a little bit. But then it started to take off, and people asked me to do more, and I started to grow, and I was surprised by all that. And so eventually I was like, I think what we need is like an apologetic video library, a place you can go, you can search, get this graphic type video for any question you have regarding like evidence for Christianity or evidence against Christianity, like objections. How do you deal with those? So that's what it is. I'm building this apologetic video library where I'm trying to deal with every objection out there to Christianity.
I gotcha. And one important question before we move on entirely. What are you drinking tonight, sir?
That.
What is that?
This is the best whiskey ever. It's called Talisker Storm.
Ooh. I've not tried that. I'll have to try that.
It's by far my favorite. It's on the island of Skye of Scotland. Cheers.
Cheers. Always. Yeah, I'm doing the same Maker's Mark that I've been doing for the past like 2 or 3 weeks. It was a Hanukkah gift, so
I have expensive tastes.
This actually, so it came as a gift set, and the French oak staves are, I like it, but I tend also to have expensive tastes when it comes to Scotch, but for bourbon, I'm a little more loose. I even sampled some Jesse James bourbon at one point that was, it's cheap, but it was pretty good.
Interesting.
But okay. This is a question that I've been pretty curious about personally also. How did you come to faith?
So it's a long story. I don't think I've ever had a come to Jesus moment, as some people say. It was a long debate process with myself. I would have called myself maybe like an agnostic deist in high school. Like I always thought the arguments for atheism were just bad. Like, I just never, there has to be at least some creator in my view. And the more I studied, the more I've solidified that. But so I started looking at evidence against Christianity, but ultimately came across Jesus mythicism sites. So I think just as fate would have it, I thought the evidence against Christianity was so bad, it actually made me start reading C.S. Lewis and Christian apologists of the time. And then I slowly but surely came back to faith and thought the New Testament was reliable. I remember someone asked me, they said, just treat the New Testament like you would any other ancient document. Don't assume it's divine. Don't assume it's filled with errors or you'd be super skeptical. Just treat it with the principle of charity is what I was told. And so I did that. And I slowly came back to becoming a Christian because of that.
So when you say mythicist sites and stuff like that, you mean the famous one that I remember being exposed to forever ago, Zeitgeist.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Jesus was based off Mithra or Horus, or there's no reason to think he ever existed. And this was funny to me because I actually had books in high school on Egyptian mythology because I just like reading that stuff. I always liked reading about pagan mythology. And so when they were telling me Jesus was based on Horus, I was like, I literally have the books at home. No, he's not. Like, where are you getting this stuff from?
Oh, so when it comes to that kind of subject matter, when it comes to, ancient texts and documents, what are some of your favorite ones to study?
Well, I mean, I think I kind of go around to different ones. Lately, I've been really into studying Mesopotamian texts. So reading things like the Tale of Adapa, or Epic of Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, Eridu Genesis as well. I did my last semester. I just got my master's degree in philosophy, and one of my last classes was on aesthetics and the philosophy of writing stories. And so I asked if I could write my paper for that class on the philosophy of storytelling in the ancient world, how ancient authors would use stories to teach philosophy. So I did a whole big study on things like the Tale of Adapa and the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as the Descent of Inanna, the Baal cycle even. And so I thought it was just really interesting to make the argument that what ancient authors were doing was philosophy, but it wasn't how we think of philosophy. They did philosophy through storytelling, like Jesus does through his parables. He teaches philosophical truths through that. They did the same thing in the ancient world. So the Tale of Adapa is very much a philosophical work on the nature of humans, sort of being stuck in this middle ground. We have wisdom like the gods, but we die like the animals. So we feel like we just don't belong in either realm. We're stuck in the middle, you would say, and we just don't feel like we have a home. And in some ways, I think the authors of Genesis were responding to that idea in Mesopotamia, not the Tale of Adapa specifically, but that idea. And they were saying, we do have a home. It's with God in Eden, but we rebelled and we lost that. So it's not this idea that we were missing a home. It's that we need to get back to where we were supposed to be. So I think that's what a lot of the ancient authors were doing in the world. They were having this debate. You had the Israelite authors on one side and you had the Mesopotamia on the other.
Absolutely. No, that tracks. It makes sense that there would definitely be or need to be a response to whatever the Mesopotamian philosophy was at the time, and the idea of trying to get back to Eden. I mean, this is something that even Jordan Peterson has talked extensively on, just how that concept is almost ingrained in human nature as it is. But so...
well, it's not also to say that I think it's all myth. I'm not saying Genesis 1-11 is a myth. I'm just saying I think you can write about historical accounts in a way to sort of respond to, other works out there. Like you could like for example, today people write against communism, like libertarians or capitalists write against communism by constantly appealing to the history of the American Revolution and the importance of that and fighting off tyranny and that kind of thing. So you can do that kind of stuff. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying it's a myth.
Absolutely. And I do get that actually. I in the public square, and it's an accusation that I have heard that you tend to think that way, but it's not something that even in our interactions through TikTok or Facebook or what have you, I've not observed it. So I definitely understand, and I'm glad the clarification was made here, because I could definitely understand where you come from in taking a much more poetic approach to the early chapters of Genesis. I mean, even rabbinically speaking, that still jives. So yeah, I'm definitely on board with that. When it comes to those kind of documents, though, in particular the ones that you're currently studying, what is the particular value that you see in those?
Well, I mean, it's really fascinating to understand the culture that produced the Bible. I mean, Genesis wasn't written by Christian monks in the Middle Ages. I mean, it was written by, pre-exilic Israelites. I would say a lot of it goes back to uh, the time of Moses. I've reluctantly accepted that position. I didn't want to, honestly. I thought I wanted to put Genesis a little further up, but I think the data is actually pushing me in that direction. So I do think you want to understand the culture that produced it. So you read things like the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters predate Moses by about 100 years or so. Very helpful to understanding what sort of that sort of culture. For example, you can understand about the sin of the guy in Joshua. His name is escaping me. Who took the gold and the cloak from Jericho. What is his name? Forget his name. But
Yeah,
he
if you
took.
hadn't asked me, I could have told you, but
Yeah, but you can understand that the same what he took is actually those type of items are talked about in the Amarna letters, so we can understand the value of them and the language they use to sort of better understand what's sort of going on there. The Amarna letters reference the Epic of Gilgamesh, so we understand that was a work that was very influential. Those ideas were spreading out around the ancient Near East. Now, I don't think the Israelite authors were aware of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but the ideas that the Epic of Gilgamesh wrote about did spread out across the ancient Near East, and they would have influenced how the Israelites wanted to respond to the Canaanites. It's in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The big theme is that Gilgamesh is trying to become immortal, and he can't. And then he gets back to the city of Uruk, and he realizes that, well, he's leaving. What's going to be immortal about him is the name he's going to leave behind. This great city that he has, and his name is imbued in this city. That's going to be so. Really, the Mesopotamians are saying the way to get immortal, the way to become immortal, is to leave a name for yourself. What is Genesis 1 constantly about? Don't leave a name it's not about building a name for yourself. It's about honoring the name of God. Stop trying to make a name for yourself. That always leads to sin and destruction and harm and pride. If you start focusing on building up the name of God, then you will truly have happiness. Then you'll truly find a place in history because you've built something worthy. And we humans are not worthy to have a name for ourselves.
it's fascinating that you bring that up, actually, because it's going to become directly relevant later on in the conversation tonight. The idea of humans making a name for themselves. But oh yeah, so we got an answer to the question. Aiken.
Hey, that's it. Yes, that's Aiken. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremiah. So on that, right? Especially references. If we're talking about references from one text to another text, were there any books removed from the Bible?
Well, what do we mean by that? Because there was not one biblical canon. I mean, Tertullian had a different canon than Origen had. Had a different canon than the Essenes had a different canon than the Pharisees had. I mean, there was this idea there was just a biblical canon. It's not really true. There were multiple canons, and so Christians through the first 300 years sort of debated over what books should belong in the canon. And I'm actually happy they did. Because, I think if you're going to take a look at something like the Book of Revelation, maybe there should be a little debate about that one before we put it in. Make sure it is scripture. We don't want to, because it mentions dragons and beasts and all these types of things. Let's have a little debate about this before we just sort of jump to conclusions here. So I'm happy that it is in scripture, but I'm also happy there was a debate about it. So if there were books removed, what you would say is that by the time the Christians had sort of set their canon at some point after, books were removed. And certainly, the Protestants removed what they would call Apocrypha books from the Old Testament. So books were removed depending on who you were talking to, depending on what your theology was. If we're talking about the Hebrew Bible specifically, the Tanakh, no. When that was sort of set, and I would say it was sort of set during the Hasmonean period, scholars like Karl van der Toorn will note, that was sort of set. You had the books of Moses, you had the writings and the prophets. And once that was set, there was not really books being removed from that.
Right. And they're even, to be fair to the history there was a fair amount of even rabbinic debate regarding certain books within the Tanakh. I think it's Ezekiel in particular that there was a decent amount of debate over whether or not it should be included in the Tanakh.
I wonder why.
Yeah, right.
I wonder why.
Oh, so when you did say that in certain schools of thought, right, the apocrypha, certain apocryphal books were removed. We'll use that term loosely. So what is the apocrypha, and also the pseudepigrapha? Because some of what we include in the Christian apocrypha, at least by rabbinic Jewish standards, would be considered pseudepigrapha, not even apocrypha.
Yeah, so let's start with pseudepigrapha. That tends to be something it's attributed to an author that probably didn't write it. So
Right.
you'll say something like, you'll hear things like, let's bring up like the Testament of Abraham. Okay, Abraham didn't write that. The third and fourth Baruch, he didn't write those. I mean, like we call these pseudepigrapha because they're attributed to a guy, he probably didn't write them. So that's a pseudepigrapha. Apocrypha is a little bit more interesting. It's where it's sort of like the authors are sort of unknown and it's unquestionable origin. I like the way Martin Luther said it. It's good. It's a good read. It's just not scriptural. Like, we can't be sure that this should be in scripture or not, but it is important, I would say, and it can be helpful. I know the Catholic Church classifies a lot of apocrypha as deuterocanonical, like the second book kind of thing. Helpful, a little bit more emphasis than what Protestants would place on it. But that's sort of like that questionable origin. Like, was this really written by Tobit, for example? Maybe, maybe not. But you know what? It can still be helpful.
Yep. So Tobit's an interesting one in particular, because it's one of the ones that we can derive much stronger an influence from Zoroastrianism, specifically because the demon that is mentioned in it is it's not a Hebrew demon. The name of it is not a Hebrew name. It's a Zoroastrian demon that's appearing in this Hebraic document. So I had an interesting discussion with Dr. Justin Sledge from Esoterica, who's got a fantastic video about Tobit and demonology and stuff like that. But when it comes to the reliability of the pseudepigrapha and apocrypha, how reliable would you say they are?
I would not say they're very reliable, especially pseudepigrapha. They're not
Right.
as reliable as I would say the books of scripture are. Like, it's pretty clear that the book of Jeremiah goes back to an historical Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch. A lot of those things definitely go back to him. I don't think that's hard to doubt. I think a lot of the stuff in the Pentateuch goes back to the historical Moses, as well as the elders that would have helped with that. I do think it was updated over time for sure. Like, I don't think Moses wrote about his own death. I don't think Moses was the most humble man ever in Numbers, for example. So I think, you have that kind of idea that these were sort of updated with commentary. But I don't think the pseudepigrapha is nearly as reliable. And the apocrypha, once again, it's like, we don't have any good evidence this can go back to these historical people that they claim to go back to, but they may be more useful than the pseudepigrapha.
Right. With the apocrypha, the way that I've personally viewed it is like, that's a case by case scenario. You have to examine each document independently. Because things like the Book of Maccabees, I think are relatively reliable, but then some of the other apocryphal books are much more questionable. And in particular, so the Book of Enoch is considered by Christians, I believe, to be apocryphal. In Judaism, it would be considered pseudepigraphal. That's one of those that I referenced earlier.
Well, it depends. I think so. It depends on the church. The Ethiopian church would include it like apocrypha, but Protestants it's pseudepigrapha. I think Catholic Church even says pseudepigrapha.
Okay, that I didn't know. So I learned something tonight. Let's see. Of these apocryphal and pseudepigraphal books, do you believe that any have been harmful to research for the lay Christian? And if so, which have been the most harmful?
Oh, where to begin? Yes, I mean, Enoch, for example, has been very harmful because people lately have been trying to argue that should be in the Bible, that it was somehow removed from the Bible. You have the same with like Jubilees or the Book of Jasher. You see the Book of Jasher mentioned in places like the Book of Joshua, and so there's this book called Jasher that was sort of lost. And then much later, there was this forged work called the Book of Jasher that came about maybe about 1,000 years ago, claiming to be the Book of Jasher. And now Christians are saying that should be in the Bible. And I'm like, No, that's a forged work. And we know because it mentions things like the Lombards, for example. The Lombards would not have been around when the historical Jasher book would have been written. So this is clearly a much later medieval document. So you have that, like Jasher, and I think Enoch as well has been quite harmful because a lot of Christians think that should be in the Bible because I do think it is referenced in places like Jude. But I mean, that doesn't mean it's scripture for a number of reasons.
Right. And we'll get into that in a minute. As far as the book of Jasher, I'm curious, maybe you can enlighten me a little bit on this, because I understand there are two, well, technically two. So the book of Jasher in Hebrew would translate as Sefer HaYashar. Now, there is a midrash that even in Orthodoxy is accepted as being a legitimate midrash. Now, the level of acceptance of midrash as being divine or what have you, that is a matter that's, of dispute even in Judaism. But the midrash Sefer HaYashar, I don't think that that's the medieval document that we refer to as the book of Jasher.
No, there's two actually. So there's two. There's what is called Jasher, and then there is pseudo Jasher. The modern book of Jasher, I think, dates to about the 13th century or so. Probably was written in Venice. That's what I think most scholars tend to think it was. And then later in the 1840s, you had some guy named Jacob Ilive published what he said was the book of Jasher, and then he actually ended up serving prison time for his forgery.
Wow.
So pseudo Jasher is clearly the one that comes from the 1800s. Then you have an older one that comes from like the Middle Ages. And the reason why we know it probably is not accurate is because this book of Jasher that came from the 1300s, it's written as sort of like this epic up about to the time of Joshua. But if you remember, the book of Jasher in the Bible is actually quoted twice. It's quoted in the book of Joshua, and then I believe it's also quoted in 2 Samuel when talking about the death of Jonathan and Saul. Well, the medieval book of Jasher does not make that reference. It doesn't contain that part. So whoever forged this document forgot to include that section in it. So it only mentions the quote that we find in the book of Joshua. It doesn't mention what we find later in the books of Samuel. So, and it also mentions people of Lombard. It mentions their conquest of Italy. That didn't occur till the 6th century AD. I mean, many of the names trace back to Arabic, Spanish, or Italian roots, these kinds of things. So it's very unlikely to actually be I don't think any scholar thinks it's the original book.
Very fascinating. A lot of that I didn't know. So definitely thank you for that. Yeah. But let's talk about Enoch then, because we mentioned that as being one of the more harmful books to the lay Christian in their biblical research. Why is that one in particular so popular?
Well, it's interesting, I would say. There's some things in Genesis 1-11 that the author just sort of brushes over. And the Book of Enoch tries to fill in those details. So I think Christians are very much like, well, we want those details filled in. The Book of Enoch does it. So why not use the Book of Enoch? Like in the book of Genesis, it says like, Enoch walked with God and then God took him. Anyway, let's move on. It's like, well, wait a minute. I would like to know more about this encounter. What sort of happened here? Why did God take him? How did God take him? What was so cool about it? But it doesn't. The authors just don't care to really fill us in more. Same with you get in Genesis 6. It mentions the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. So anyway, let's move on to something else. Like, it's like, well, wait a minute. What are those doing there? Who are they? And there's a lot of like debate and interpretation going on there. And so the Book of Enoch tries to fill in those details in much, much later time. And so I think that's why Christians are very much intrigued by it. And they want to put it in the Bible because they want those details filled in.
Right. So when it comes to the Book of Enoch, I understand it's not really one continuous book. It's a compilation of numerous books.
Yeah.
So I don't know that you can give the whole book in totality a date, but how old is the oldest portion of Enoch that we know of?
Well, it's basically a compilation of books. What scholars would say is, and this is scholarly reconstruction, so it may not be accurate, but they would say the first part is called the Book of the Watchers, followed by the book of the parables, followed by the book of luminaries, then the dream visions, then the epistle of Enoch, then the book of Noah, and then sometimes you see at the end another book of Enoch at the end. Most scholars, I would say, they'd say they dated somewhere between 400 BC and 200 AD. This is when these things were sort of being written and then they're sort of compiled together at a later date. There's debate over when that actually happened. But yeah, generally it was a compilation. It was his own canon, you could say.
Gotcha. So as far as like the Qumran scrolls, I think if I remember correctly, I think the Book of the Watchers, there's a particular fragment that the Book of the Watchers is one of the older of the fragments.
Yeah.
How old is the most complete version of it that we have to date?
Well, the most complete version of it, you're going to get in the Ethiopian version. So this is the thing, though, is like the most complete version, I believe, is like 16th century. We have fragments in Greek prior to that, for sure. I believe we even have some Aramaic fragments of it, if I'm not mistaken. But the most complete version is going to be in I believe it's the Ge'er language. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that way. It's like Ge-ER language. And so it's preserved in the Ethiopian church. And that's the most complete version of what we have.
I gotcha. Now, this is something that, at least in my own research, I came across, and maybe you can correct me if I'm mistaken on this. But as far as what has been found in the Qumran scrolls, my own research has led me to believe we really only have 2 of the books that make up what we now know as Enoch, that come from fragments of the Qumran scrolls, being the Book of the Watchers and the Book of the Luminaries, or the astronomical book. Is that something that you can confirm, or is that incorrect information?
Well, I mean, what we have, so the Book of Luminaries would be chapters of Enoch, be chapters 72 to 82.
Right.
Yeah, we have a lot of fragments of the Book of the Watchers in there, but we have, like, I believe we have references to like Enoch 89 in some Aramaic fragments. So I think we actually have the one that comes right after that, which is also the Dream Visions.
Right.
So we do have some copies, I believe, of that. And I think we even have some fragments of the Epistle of Enoch, which starts in chapter 91 as well. So we do have some fragments. We do have a lot of Aramaic fragments. We're missing sort of the stuff in between the Book of the Luminaries and the Book of the Watchers. So I don't think we have anything stuff that happens in there. But we do have fragments of various copies of Enoch in the Aramaic Qumran fragments, for example.
I gotcha. Now, the question that I know a lot of people are eager to know, and you hinted at it a little earlier, is Enoch quoted in the Bible? I know there's a lot of claims that Jude quotes Enoch, that Peter quotes Enoch, and even that Jesus quotes Enoch. What are your thoughts regarding those claims?
So I do think Jude quotes Enoch. I don't think there's enough evidence to say Jesus quotes Enoch, because Jesus, when he would quote the scriptures, he'd say something like, "Have you not read?" Right. He sometimes, there's at one point he makes some sort of vague reference to not marrying like the angels. People say that's found in Enoch, but he seems to be just quoting a common oral understanding at the time. He doesn't really refer to it as scripture. This is just something he knows about. So, and we also find that teaching in, I believe, the works of Baruch, for example. I believe it's in Second Baruch, if I'm not mistaken. So, it's not this idea that he's quoting the Book of Enoch, but I do think Jude quotes a bit. And in 2 Peter, you make a case as well that he quotes it. My take on that is that doesn't make it scripture, because in Acts 17, Paul quotes Aratus. It's a Stoic philosopher. That doesn't make Aratus scripture. We know that Paul quoted some rabbinic ideas as well in some of the letters to Corinthians, for example. It doesn't make that scripture either. You can quote something and it doesn't make it part of scripture. What makes it scripture is just the reference. And I think what Jude is doing is he's giving examples to the people at the time to persevere. Look, these people struggled, this guy struggled, but he came out on top, kind of thing. And so here's some well-known stories you know about. Some are historical, some are not. Let me quote from the Testament of Moses and the Book of Enoch. And this will give you encouragement to keep going forward. I think that's all Jude is doing. To say that he's sort of proving the Book of Enoch as scripture is quite a leap in logic.
Right. Yeah. No. And yeah, definitely. So Aratus, and I think there's two other Greek philosophers even that it may be disputed that Paul quotes. As
Oh
far as
yeah.
rabbinic sources, one that I know for sure where Paul says that the law is a schoolmaster or a pedagogue. That's actually a direct quote from the Midrash Rabbah, like the very first section. That's the first thing the rabbi says.
Yeah, he
Um,
quotes Aristotle twice, I believe, and he references him a couple other times. So, at Romans 2:15, as well as Galatians 5, when he says, "Against such things there is no law," that's a direct quote from Aristotle's Politics.
that I didn't know. That's
Mhm.
awesome.
Yeah, he's
So
directly quoting Aristotle. Yeah.
well, so I mean, I guess that makes sense because Gamliel's school actually was particularly known for having a familiarity with, at least in some aspects, Greek philosophy. So that's something Paul should have been familiar with.
Hmm.
So, is Enoch a messianic book?
Well, I mean, he talks about the Messiah, so yes, actually.
Who does Enoch say the Messiah is?
Well, in First Enoch, I believe it's 71, but some numberings put it, I think, a little before that. It says Enoch is standing there and at the head of the days, and he comes with the angels Michael, Raphael, and they come before him and they greeted him, and Enoch is asking, "Who is this Son of Man he keeps seeing?" And they say to him, "You are that Son of Man who was born for righteousness, and righteousness dwells on you." So right there in the Book of Enoch, around I believe it's in chapter 71, but sometimes it's a little bit earlier depending on the translation. It says pretty clearly that Enoch is the Son of Man. He's the Messiah that's supposed to come back. So generally, as scholars will say, the author of this section of Enoch literally thought, I guess, Enoch was going to return somehow to Earth and become the Messiah.
Right. Right. That's so. It's interesting. I did read somewhere that is one of the primary reasons for speculation that Enoch is an AD document, or that parts of it are AD document
Right.
because of the use of the phrase "Son of Man" as a messianic title, whereas in the Tanakh, outside of one citation in Daniel, we don't really see that. The term "Son of
Right.
Man" just generically means human being. And I would even argue that in Daniel, it still generically means human being, but the human being in question is Messiah in that aspect. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's the title "Son of Man" as a messianic title. We see that more so in New Testament documents and earlier Christian documents, which is where it's like, okay, well, that Enoch shares much more commonality with early Christian documents in that aspect than it does with older Semitic documents.
Yeah, and the other thing is that reference to the Son of Man that doesn't show up in the Qumran fragments. So it might be a book that was written after Qumran, and it was sort of added into the Book of Enoch when they were compiling it. Whoever did that, so that may not have even been in the Qumran community, for example.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that
I'm
shows
gonna
up
have
at
to
the
pick your brain about that a little bit more.
well, that shows up at the end of the Book of Luminaries. So, the Book of Parables. Excuse me. Book of Parables is chapter 37 to 71. And the reference to Enoch being the Son of Man is in chapter 71. So it's in the Book of Parables that they start identifying Enoch as the Messiah.
Fascinating. Okay, so how does the content of Enoch intersect with Genesis?
Well, in a lot of ways. So the main thing people sort of draw on is the idea of the Watchers and the Nephilim. Genesis 6 1 to 4 mentions how the sons of God took the daughters of men as wives and they bore children to them. And some interpretations say the children of them are the Nephilim. Well, who are they? Well, Enoch tries to fill in the gaps. It says, well, these sons of God are the Watchers, these angelic beings. They come down on Mount Hermon and they make this pact and they say, we're going to have wives and we'll do this evil deed. And so they do. And so then so that's what it's sort of trying to fill in the gap. Enoch is trying to explain what Genesis 6 1 to 4 is saying. It's giving an interpretation to it. It's saying that what Genesis 6 1 to 4 is saying is that these angelic beings came down, took human form, I guess, married these daughters of man, and they bore giant children, these sort of giant monsters that had to be wiped out by the flood. So it's trying very hard to fill in the gaps of this really small passage we find in Genesis 6 1 to 4. That's the main way it intersects with Genesis.
I gotcha. So you would say that's probably one of the more popular interpretations of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is the idea of these angelic beings coming down and mating with human women.
Yeah, that is a very popular interpretation today. Michael Heiser advocates for that as well, although he rejects the Book of Enoch. But yeah, it's this idea that Genesis 6, 1 to 4 is saying that angels came down, had sex with women, and had giant children as offspring.
Now, would you say that there are any presuppositions that are in effect in that interpretation?
What do you mean by presuppositions?
I mean, maybe with respect to the definition of the term "sons of God," daughters of men, right? So the way that I have typically tried to at least ascertain some meaning from the passages to separate all of the groups that are mentioned, right? Which I count a total of 4, right? You've got the sons of God, you've got the daughters of men, you've got the Nephilim, and you've got the men of renown, right? And it seems to me in a lot of interpretations, either one or more of those groups get conflated with one another.
Right. Yeah, there is this sort of presupposition in there. First, you have the sons of God. Well, anytime that phrase comes up elsewhere in the Bible, it refers to angelic beings or members of God's divine council, basically members that are not human, some sort of like member of the divine realm. You see this in places like Psalm 82, for example, the Book of Job as well as I believe Deuteronomy. I believe it's chapter 32, maybe. Yeah, I think it's there. And so typically that phrase refers to divine beings. The question is does the author think that's what it means here? Maybe not. I mean, sometimes you see, like, for example, the phrase son of man, as you mentioned earlier, can mean something different depending on who the author is what author is writing. They could use it to mean something entirely different. Daniel 7 verse Enoch, or Ezekiel, for example, seems to be slightly different in terms of what they mean by those words.
Right.
So the question is, does the author of Genesis 6 think that as well? Another presupposition seems to be that the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. Maybe not. There are some scholars that argue that's not the case because he just says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. So, right. And also afterwards. So what does that mean? Some will say, well, that's a reference to the flood. They were on the earth before and after the flood. But some say, no, it's actually referring to when the sons of God came and mated with the daughters of women. The Nephilim were on the earth when this was going on, and also afterwards when they came down. So it could be an entirely different group. The Nephilim could not be the direct offspring. The only thing that I would say are the offspring are the men of renown, the mighty, or more literally, the men of the name, men of Shem. Right. So men of the name is a more literal understanding of it. So these were the mighty men. Those, I think, are pretty clearly the descendants of the sons of God and the daughters of men. But some think they're another way you could call them is the Nephilim. Some think the Nephilim is another group entirely. You know, it depends. It's hard to really say.
Right. And so, in particular, when it comes to the term the sons of God, now I'm fully aware of the citation in Job that I think is one of the more popular ones regarding the interpretation of it being as angels. But when it comes to the breakdown of the Hebrew in this particular aspect, and I don't know if you're familiar. But like the Schottenstein edition of the Chumash follows what I think is Rashi's interpretation of this, which even though Rashi allows for the idea that it could be referencing angelic beings, Rashi actually translates it as sons of the rulers. Why can you explain why that is?
Well, in the ancient Near East, it was very common to refer to the rulers as some sort of like God's son or the son of the god. So in the ancient epic of, I think there's an ancient epic that's now escaping my mind the moment I was just about to say it, but it's a Canaanite epic. It mentions a guy named Daniel. I think it's the tale of Akkad is what it is. It mentions that, you know, the king is the son of El. So El is the head deity in the Canaanite pantheon, and the king was considered to be his son of El. In Mesopotamian texts, like the Gudea cylinders, it also says like, you know, the king there is the son of his goddess. It was very common in the ancient world to refer to a people group or a king as a son of a god or a goddess. David is called God's son in the Bible. Israel is called God's son. This kind of idea. So you can have this idea that a ruler is also thought of as God's son or as the son of the gods kind of thing. And so that could be what's sort of happening in Genesis 6. It'd be a different author than how the author of, the book of Job is writing, and he's using it to refer to like rulers, for example. This was a time period when certain rulers started becoming polygamous and taking as many wives as they wanted. And then they bore these offspring, these men that were just, all they cared about was making a name for themselves.
I gotcha. So what I guess, and this I know a lot of people are waiting for tonight. What or who do you believe the Nephilim are?
Well, I sort of just hinted to it. I think they are rulers. I definitely take that view. Here's my reasoning. Internal evidence, I think, is going to be our best clue. And I think it's very rare when a word is sort of like, or a phrase is defined for us in the Bible. Sometimes we have to look elsewhere to try to get a meaning of what that word is. But in Genesis 6, 1-4, it seems like sons of God is defined for us as humans. It says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives as they chose. Then verse 3 says, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. So that seems to be telling us that who God is mad at, humans, flesh. He's not mad at humans and divine beings. He's mad at just humans. So that would say the two classes in verse 2, daughters of men, sons of God, would be two different groups of humans. Compare that to Genesis 3. God has his anger directed at Adam and Eve and the serpent. And the serpent, I would say, is a divine being, namely a rebellious, seraph, for example. So there we see God's anger is actually directed specifically at another player. But in Genesis 6, we only see God's anger is directed at humans. So that would make me suggest that there's no divine beings in play here. It's just humans are messing up in some way and God is mad at them.
So, okay, so that kind of lends right into my next question, which was going to be, who do you believe the sons of God are? But I guess for you, it would be the same thing.
Yeah, I would say these are rulers. These are ruler. And here's another thing I would use is that I think the authors of Genesis are very much anti-polygamous. Anytime they write about, Abraham or Jacob engaging in polygamy, disaster always sort of comes from that. There's strife between the offspring. There's strife between the wives. They never paint polygamy in a good light. And notice how the story sort of ends just before Genesis 6 between the genealogies. It ends with Lamech, who takes multiple wives, and he becomes this horrible guy. Well, the story picks up right off, I think, where it left off. Like, not only are the sons of Cain taking multiple wives, now even the rulers who are meant to lead humanity towards God, they are also engaging in this horrible polygamous practice. So I think that's kind of what's happening. First it was the sons of Cain, and then it spanned to, even the rulers that are supposed to be leading people in the truth.
So, yeah, so I guess by rulers, you mean at this point, like the descendants of Seth?
Perhaps, yeah. I would not say it's specifically the descendants of Seth, per se. I would say it's clearly people that came from that line, but it's specifically rulers, people that are meant to be sort of ruling over the general population. They have decided they think they can take multiple wives.
Gotcha. So from an internal perspective, internal to the text, angels never mated with humans then?
I don't think so. To be honest, philosophically speaking, I think there's some problems there. I mean, like, it would be kind of like humans looking at ants going, man, we should become ants and mate with them. It would be weird. I mean, we're talking about heavenly beings. I don't think they're really much attracted to us. I think they have their own class, and they're not going to be really worried about us down here. So I don't think that's what's going on now.
Now, an interesting side note that you may be familiar with is the idea that these rulers were also called Nephilim because they were performing their own variation or form of abortions at the time, because the word Nephilim is very, very closely related to the word for abortion in Hebrew. It's a matter of fact, it's almost an identical pronunciation.
I've never heard that before now.
Yeah, that's something that's mentioned in one of the Midrash. I think the Midrash Rabbah. Don't quote me on that. I'll get you a source on that though, because it's fascinating uh, to look into the etymology of the word and how some of the rabbis have kind of tied that into the narrative.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I've never heard of that before.
Absolutely. So besides Enoch and Jubilees, are you aware of any other extra biblical texts that give account of this time period and these events?
Sure. Have you ever heard of the Book of Giants?
The I mean, isn't the Book of Giants is that not part of Enoch?
No, it's not one of the specific books, I believe. It's a second century BC work. It sort of gives an account of, the giants that came, the Nephilim, kind of same kind of thing, just kind of a different spin on it.
I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. It was very influential in Manichaean thought, that early Christian heresy.
So curious then, what does the Book of Giants what's the narrative there? Is it just very similar to Enoch, or is it different?
It's pretty similar. I mean, it's commentary on Genesis 6:1-4, like Jubilees is like the Genesis Apocryphon, or that kind of stuff. I can't remember exactly what really goes on it, but again, it's talking about the Watchers having the sons of God, these holy ones, rebelling in heaven, breaking the boundary with creation, and lusting after the daughters of men. It's again, they're very interested in this passage, the same reason a lot of modern people are. It's this brief, cryptic passage, doesn't give a lot of details, so it's just trying to fill in the gaps in a lot of the same ways.
I got you. Yeah. So when it comes to filling in gaps, this I found interesting is the Book of Jubilees. At least from what I've looked at, looks like it's attempting to rectify possible perceived contradictions in Genesis on the part of the author. There are parts where it quotes Genesis directly, and there are parts where it omits something that's actually written in Genesis, but then there are other parts where it's adding and embellishing on the text.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any specific contradictions that come to mind that that the author might be trying to avoid?
Yeah. You mean contradictions in Genesis or contradictions with the Book of Enoch?
With the Book of Enoch, I mean, obviously we would both agree that Genesis doesn't really have any contradictions that would be to that degree. But on the part of the author, perceived contradictions, that I guess that was more what I was asking. But even if there are contradictions with the Book of Enoch, which is interesting because the Jubilees and the calendar that's given therein is almost entirely reliant on Enoch, which is fascinating when you consider the places where it does contradict Enoch. So yeah, expound on that a little bit.
Well, Enoch says that the Watchers came down and taught men technology. They taught them all these secret arts. They even taught men and women to use makeup. Oh no, not that.
No.
Yes, horrible. But if you read Genesis 4, the authors there are pretty much, these were just, humans were coming up with their own technology. They discovered instruments to play like the harp and the lyre, and they were building cities. They didn't need to get this knowledge from angels. They were able to come up with it on their own. So I think that's a pretty big contradiction we have there between Enoch and Genesis. Where did men get these technology from? Now I think you could make it jive, but I think it's a little hard. I think Enoch is very much saying no. They're taking the Mesopotamian idea. In Mesopotamian mythology, you have the Apkallu, who sort of come down and teach humans all these sacred arts that scholars like Jean Bottero talk about. But in Genesis, no, that was just human ideas. It's a lot less mythical, actually, despite what people say. This comes about from human civilization. So I think that's an interesting contradiction, because Enoch takes that old Mesopotamian idea that it was actually these divine beings that came down and taught technology to man. Right.
And now, and this is again something you might be able to further educate me on, because the Book of Jubilees it's called the Book of Jubilees because it's trying to follow the Jubilee cycle, right? And it's counting Jubilees from I guess the creation. But when it comes to the timeline of Abraham, at least from my own math, as I've applied it to the book, it looks like the lifetime of Abraham is either missing one full Jubilee, or that one full Jubilee was added to the lifetime of Abraham in the book, because the math doesn't add up with the age that we get from Genesis that Abraham reached. Is that something you've looked at, or?
I looked at a little bit. It was very common. Let me see if I can find that document I have. It was very common for them to like use numbers more symbolically than actually, like literally like, oh yes, this is, we're actually going to calculate all these years and they're going to be just coincidentally based on a Gregorian calendar, as a lot of modern people think. That's really not what they were doing a lot with numbers. Let me give you an example first from the Bible. So, I might get some pushback from this, but I think it's a pretty strong case. If you go to the book of Kings, for example, it says the Exodus was 480 years before Solomon began constructing the temple. And people go, okay, so that means the Exodus would have had to happen in 1446. Well, in the ancient Near East, temple dedications would often use symbolic numbers. So we see this in, for example, in Egypt with the 400-year stele. It says that, like the temple that was built there, the temple to Set, was built in the 400th year of like the fourth month on the fourth day. Okay, it wasn't. We dug that site. We know that it's off about 50 years or so. And so what they're really doing is they're trying to get these like highly symbolic numbers. Same with the temple of Ninurta in Assyria. They use this exact round number of 720 on purpose. That's generally what they were sort of doing with numbers a lot. They were not using them to be literal counting. They were using it more to teach some sort of symbolic purposes. The Egyptian historian Manetho probably does this with Egyptian kings. He wants a certain round number he wants to arrive at. So he may have added entire dynasties in there. Egyptologists still debate about that whole thing. And so, he might be doing that as well. And so let me see if I can find that thing here on Jubilees I have. But yeah, generally that's what they're sort of doing when they're doing these big, long calculation dates. They're not trying to be accurate and actually calculate. They're doing it more to sort of reach these ideal numbers they want to reach to. Oh, here it is. So for example, Democritus fabricated ages in order to fit a predetermined value, according to Ben Zion Wacholder in How Long Did Abram Stay in Egypt? According to Craig Olson, he notes in his book or in his paper, How Old Was Father Abraham? Reexamining the Patriarchal Lifespans in Light of Archaeology. He says the Book of Jubilees condensed, ignored, and changed biblical chronologies to make Israel's history fit into a series of jubilees of years. So he's doing this on purpose because he wants to make these idealized round numbers fit.
Gotcha. So, and my colleague running the background for us just posted the citation we were talking about earlier regarding Nephilim pertaining to abortions. That would be the Midrash Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah 26:7. Is going to be the citation for that.
Look it up.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I like this. I like to read that. It'd be interesting to read.
Absolutely. But we're kind of at the end here. If you're open to answering some questions from the chat, I'm sure that some people have some questions for you. Guys, go ahead and fire up if you've got a question for Michael.
While they're doing that, one more thing about Genesis 6 I wanted to say is that my interpretation is I do have a longer video on my YouTube channel called Genesis 6a, the Nephilim. And it's like a 36-minute video where I defend my interpretation that it's not about angels, it's about these rulers that rebelled. So if people want to see more, they can see that video. But I also say in the video, this isn't a hill to die on. In my view, I could be wrong about this because it's such a cryptic and short passage. We ultimately don't know. But I tend to lean more with the rabbinic interpretation on this, that it's referring to rulers.
Right. Right. And so now here's the funny thing about that. Because obviously the idea of angels mating with humans is a much more popular Christian interpretation of the passage. But the position that you take does have some popularity in Christianity, but I would say it's probably a minority position. The same is true in reverse for Judaism and the rabbinic position. The majority position would be much more in line with what you've voiced here, whereas there is still a minority position that it's referring to angels. Now, fascinating about that is the Ramban in particular. He says it's the best rendering of a literal reading of the passage, but he says that if you're going to take that route with it, you do have to account for the inherent mystical nature of the passage. So, like, even if you're going to read it literally, you have to understand that it's not literal.
Yeah, it's very mystical. I mean, it mentions Mount Sinai, for example. I mean, it's clearly written long after Moses would have been at Sinai. It seems to reference books like Isaiah and Jeremiah as well. So, it's, you can't, I think there's a lot of problems trying to take it literally, as some Christians today want to do.
I gotcha. So I don't know if this question was, let's see. What is the validity of the claim that the pastoral epistles were not written by Paul?
Okay, give me 1 second here. So this is a popular claim. Now, here's my response to that. Yes and no. Here's the thing: is we got to remember is that we tend to think of people writing letters as like Paul goes into his study and says, "I'll be right back, guys. I need to write a letter to the Corinthians, and then I'll come back and join you guys for supper." That's not how letters in the ancient world were written. Typically, they were written via scribe. There would be a community effort. Paul often, in like 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, mentions 2 other authors were helping him write these letters. These are not letters alone. So that's the first thing to think. At one point, the Roman writer Cicero wrote to a friend of his and said, "Hey, I just got exiled from Rome. Can you write in my name and tell people what's going on?" So he's telling someone else to write on his behalf. He's telling someone else to sort of say, like, do this for me. And obviously Cicero was not writing, but they had the permission to write in his pen. And there's an interesting work called Collections of Cicero's Letters by Tyrrell and Purser. And what they sort of note in there, and the reason I know that is because I was just at a conference and I talked to a scholar, E. Randolph Richards, about this, and he gave me this as a source. But they note in that work that a lot of Cicero's letters really vary in style. Like, just they seem like they're written by entirely different people. Well, that's because Cicero was often working with different scribes. He was often, Cicero talks about his brother sort of just telling scribes to go write letters, and then he'll just approve them later. And these were different scribes. He was not, sitting and doing them all. So you got to think about Paul writing letters like that. There's going to be variation. They're not always going to sound like it's the same guy that wrote Romans, for example, or 1 Corinthians, because there's this variation. I think it's entirely possible Paul could have, for some letters, like maybe Ephesians, or maybe even to Titus, he could have told a scribe, sat with him for like a half hour per se, and said, "Here's what I want you to write. Go do it. I got other stuff I got to attend to, but here's what I want you to send out." So I think you can argue for the validity of the pastoral epistles. With that in mind, you have to take it in its ancient Near Eastern context. Now, I'll admit I've not done a full study on it yet. That's something that's on the back burner right now on my research. I don't think there's some people say there's theological differences with the pastoral epistles and Paul's other letters. I don't think so. I think that's kind of a stretch. And I think you can make a pretty good case that internally they're in agreement. Right. But generally, that's kind of how I would take. You cannot think of Paul writing letters as like we write letters. Paul would have had a scribe, and he would have probably been walking around the room or sitting there going, "Here's what I need to say. Help me organize it. Help me write this out," kind of thing. So you got to think of it like that.
Right. Especially and I know there are varying opinions on this, but there's at least an idea that Paul may not have been very proficient in his Koine Greek. In particular, there's an instance in Acts where he seems to be being made fun of by the Stoics because of his lack of proficiency in Greek. So certainly if he's using different Greek scholars or Greek scribes at this point for this method of authorship, that would definitely explain why they would all end up sounding somewhat different. Because even for us here at Alternate Media, if I write an article or if Seamus writes an article or what have you, typically what happens is our producer, Austin, will go behind us and then edit it to sound like a unified voice. So you probably wouldn't be able to tell if I wrote an article or if Seamus wrote an article because our producer edits them to where it sounds like the company's voice rather than just, one person or the other. Another interesting question here from Joshua Foote in, I guess that's 1 Peter 2:4. And this is one of those that we referenced earlier. It speaks about angels sinning. Do you think that is referring to a midrash because angels don't have free will in Judaism? Christians use this verse to back up angels mating. So yeah, I don't know if you were familiar with that concept, but in Orthodox Judaism, angels do not have free will, at least not the same free will that we as human beings have.
Yeah, I mean, it is a Christianity that angels do have free will, especially in like Revelation, for example. You have the rebellion in heaven kind of thing going on. Second Peter 2:4 says, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains," actual word there's Hades or Tartarus. Tartarus. Sorry, cast them into Tartarus and committed them in chains. Some say pits or gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. Now that's just a vague reference. It's much harder to say that it's directly coming from Enoch, especially since it uses the Greek word Tartarus, which comes from Greek mythology, for example. I tend to think it's just referring to when angels rebelled, and they sort of just been chained up until judgment, kind of thing.
Interesting thing when it comes to the idea of a rebellion from heaven. Now, again, at least as a theological position, angels don't have the same free will that human beings have. But for the purposes of Midrash, oftentimes they will be anthropomorphized to have that kind of free will. And when it comes to Midrash, there's multiple types. Some are taken more literally and some more figuratively. But so the Midrash Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is actually one that does outline a type of rebellion from heaven. So it might be something you'd be interested in looking into, because in that, again, they're anthropomorphized to have a bit more free will.
Yeah. I think it's definitely clear in Christian scriptures that they do have some sort of free will, more in line with what human has. I think that's just a disagreement between the rabbinic literature and the Christian literature.
Right. I think when it comes to stuff like that, you and I are definitely in agreement that, first of all, being referenced in the Bible in and of itself doesn't establish any sense of divinity to the entirety of the document being quoted by the author, and I think a lot more times than we think, and this is something I've heard supposed even regard to Jude, is that maybe Jude is not necessarily quoting Enoch, but that Jude and Enoch are pulling from a common source.
Yeah, that could be
a common older oral tradition, so to speak. And
possible.
Let's see. It doesn't really look like there's too many more. So go.
If you want, I think of the first case of a divine rebellion, I would say is actually in Genesis 3, because I think the serpent is very much a rebellious seraph. If you look at ancient Near Eastern iconography of seraph, they're all often depicted as winged snakes. This idea, we see this on like seals, like the seal of Ahaz. You have, the Lord is depicted as like this shining sun disk, and around him are these serpents, which are seraph. So I think what's actually happening in Genesis 3 is one of those divine rebellions. And this is why Eve is fine striking up a conversation with a talking snake. She would have been in what Eden was, God's temple, where there would have been seraph, like what Isaiah sees in Isaiah 6. God's surrounded by the winged seraph praising him. And so, here's one of God's servants who wants to have a conversation with her, and she's fine with that.
So we could definitely have a fascinating conversation about Genesis 3, I think, because and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Rabbi David Foreman from the Aleph Beta ministry. He's got a whole series called Serpents of Desire, I think was the initial article title, where where he goes over Genesis 3, and fascinating. It's actually rather difficult to make a case from the text itself without drawing from external, without going to either Ezekiel or Isaiah or Revelation. It's pretty difficult to, from the text alone, build a case that the serpent itself is Satan in that aspect. And there's a number of lessons that he derives from that. But yeah, I would say, regarding that rebellion, that's actually where Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, that's kind of where he inserts this idea of a rebellion from heaven. Is so essentially what he says is that the angel Samael mounted the great serpent, so to speak, and went to go and cause man to fall. So that actually is still very consistent with the Midrash on the matter.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Let's see. Bobby K here says, IP, what is your favorite go-to ancient cultures primer?
So I would always recommend John Walton's books. His book, Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament, is very good to understanding the ancient culture. Any books by Jean Bottero. He's got some great books on ancient Mesopotamian religion. I've read about 3 of his books now. That was a good place. So those are some pretty good books to start with, I would say. Depends on really what you want to specialize in. Religion, culture, different wisdom texts. I mean, it depends really how they understood the law of the day. I mean, it's all very divorced from our own culture. Even the Second Temple period is very much still divorced from the pre-exilic Israel period and the ancient Near East. There's a lot of cultural differences that we tend to miss sometimes. I mean, it's like trying to compare British culture today to British culture under Alfred the Great. I mean, there's going to be differences for sure.
Right.
And so definitely check out some of those books.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And again, thank you for making time to do this. I know you're an extraordinarily busy man, and I definitely appreciate you coming on and having this interview with me. I'm very excited about it, and I think that this is probably going to be very helpful to a lot of the listeners and viewers. Go ahead and tell our viewers where to find your information if they don't already know.
So yeah, I'm on youtube.com/inspiring philosophy, patreon.com/inspiring philosophy. Same with Twitter. Same thing with Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the same name. So you just go look for me there and you'll find me, I guarantee you.
Absolutely. Again, thank you everybody who decided to join in and watch this tonight. Definitely go and check out Michael's stuff. Inspiring Philosophy, especially on TikTok. He's very active on TikTok, and his YouTube page, a lot of wonderful videos. I checked out several of those yesterday regarding your response to the documentary hypothesis. They were spectacular. So definitely go check those out. Check him out. He's an awesome guy. And I'm just going to close it out. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and shalom.